Hey guys, I want to take you through the first part of our notes on the history of South Africa and the system of apartheid. South Africa has a very interesting and unique history, and it is a beautiful country that I love and have visited and have always been interested in since I was your age. So you have guided notes to fill in as we go through this. But our objective is to explain the creation and end of the system of apartheid in South Africa and the roles of two people, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. So we know that during the age of exploration that Europeans were going down around down the coast of Africa and up the east coast of Africa to get to India and to get to Asia, which is what the Columbus and the other European explorers that went west instead of down and around Africa, what they were also looking for India and Asia when they landed in the New World. But during this time of the age of exploration and the trade between Asia and Europe that was happening, there was a lot of contact with coastal Africa, but people didn't live there. They, stopped and traded or got resources that they needed, but they did not settle and live there the way that like the British settlers who came and colonized the 13 colonies in America did, with the exception of South Africa. So the Dutch people who come from the country of the Netherlands in Europe, they settled in the Cape of Good Hope, which is at the very bottom tip of Africa, in 1652. And they originally settled there to provide, water, fresh food and water to the ships that were traveling from Europe to Asia. But they did start taking over the lands of some of the native people who resisted, but like the other examples we've discussed, were no match to the weaponry and technology of the Europeans. So the Dutch called themselves Boers, B-O-E-R. So that that was 1652 when they first established their colony. And then came the British, and the British took control of South Africa from the Dutch, and they both thought of themselves as superior to Black Native Africans. So the whole system of racism and oppression towards the native Black people, or that idea of, the white man's burden, or just racist ideas that they were better and superior and more civilized than the groups living there, even though the British criticized the Dutch because they said that the British were inhumane to the native people. But the British were inhumane to them as well. They didn't see it that way, but yeah. So in 1685, the first policy of white superiority became visible when a law was passed that would not allow whites and Africans to marry in the territory. So they were starting this whole separation early on. They just didn't even see themselves the same as the native people. In fact, the Dutch called their language Afrikaans with a K, and they called themselves Afrikaners with a K, so that they saw themselves as, a different African than the African people who were already there. So the British and the Dutch did have a war, the Boer War, and the British won and took control of South Africa. Okay? There's a painting of the first European settlers, the Dutch East India Company, and I'm not surprised they wanted to settle there because I have been there, and it is absolutely phenomenally beautiful down there at the Cape of Good Hope, down at the southern tip of South Africa and of the continent of Africa. Okay, so power. So more European settlers came to South Africa than anywhere else on the continent. And that is why South Africa is the only country in Africa with like a large population of white people. In 1910, Great Britain established officially the Union of South Africa as a country. And when they did that, the power to make laws and govern was only given to whites. So again, this whole system of being separate already existed, and the whites already had power and had already kind of pushed the native people off of their land. And there were actual battles and, you know, violence between some groups. But in 1948, a new political party came into power called the National Party, and they voted to have a bunch of laws, to pass a bunch of laws, kind of like Jim Crow laws in the South, but more extreme. And there was a much larger part of the population that was, you know, black native South African ancestry. But so they're a real small slice of the population who are governing and dictating what happens to everybody, and especially to the black South Africans. So they called these laws collectively apartheid. And the word apartheid means separateness in Afrikaner. There they are, the National Party. You can see they clearly do not represent, in the way that they look, the entire population of South Africa, because whites only made up about 14% of the population, but they made up 100% of the government. So apartheid was South Africa's policy of racial discrimination. Racial segregation existed in South Africa before apartheid, but didn't become legal or law until 1948. I didn't finish my note on that slide, but it lasted, the system of apartheid went from 1948 to 1994. So I would like for you to jot that down on your notes page, somewhere on that first page, nice and bold, so you know the years that we're talking about when we say apartheid. Okay, so the National Party, who was in charge, enforced apartheid through passing laws across South Africa. Apartheid was both a social policy and a political policy of racial segregation and discrimination. So it didn't apply just to, you know, official government things, but it was also how people were expected to live and interact with one another, and basically they were to be kept completely apart. In Afrikaans, the language of white South Africans, apartheid means literally apartness. Okay, you can see here signs that were used during the apartheid era, and in the top left, the bottom half of that is in Afrikaans, and you see what the sign says on the bottom slide picture. All right, so this policy had a huge impact on the country, and it separated South Africa into whites and non-whites, and it restricted where anyone who was not white could live, work, travel, sit, go to the bathroom, eat, etc. Under apartheid, blacks could not vote or participate in government. Why? Because if they did, they would obviously outvote the National Party. Here again, you see signs on, it looks like the top one maybe is entering maybe a public transit, maybe like a train station, perhaps. I'm not sure. But the one on the right is obviously at a beach in Durban, this bathing area reserved for the sole use of members of the white race group. All right, so apartheid included many laws that separated the white population from the country's non-white population. So when you think about how could they manage to control all of these people, this huge majority of the population that's black, and be able to do that without being like overturned or without being rebelled against successfully because they obviously just the blacks outnumber the whites by tons. So they made very specific laws to prevent that from happening. So the Population Registration Act assigned every citizen a single racial identity, even if they were more than one race. So if they were colored, if they were mixed, they were not considered white and could not vote. And y'all, this isn't that long ago. 1948 is not that long ago, like 70 years ago. I mean, yeah. So the Mixed Marriages Act also made it a crime for whites to marry anyone outside of their race group. If you know who Trevor Noah is from Comedy Central, he has a book. He wrote a book called Born a Crime because he had a black mother and white father, I think. And there's a kids version of his story too. If you're interested in reading it, I have a copy in the classroom, but it's an interesting, autobiography of somebody who's lives in America that you might recognize that grew up in this apartheid or in the aftermath of the apartheid era. Okay. Again, more signs. The Group Areas Act divided South Africa into different areas where the different race groups were allowed to live. So a lot of the land that was given to black South Africans was the worst land for living and farming, so that they, had basically ensuring that they would struggle. And they had these pass laws that made it mandatory for all blacks to carry a pass book at all times. And they could only be in certain, areas called homelands. So the government created these homelands, which were areas for non-white South Africans to separate them from the white population. And so they set up these 10 homelands, also called Bantustans, and they were filled by 3.5 million people, these 10 areas. So even though whites only represented about 10% of the population, they now have 80% of the land, and they're forcing all of the non-whites to live in this small percentage of the country's land. And like I said, it wasn't good land. The Afrikaners lived in upscale neighborhoods while native South Africans basically lived in slums. And I'll show you, I've seen them, and it's, we'll look at some pictures and talk about that tomorrow. All right, so the Bantustan homelands. So you can see where they're set up and who was, or what they're called, the Transkei, the Venda. Yeah, so these are where the homelands were located. Okay, there's a picture that really kind of shows you what the homelands were like. So no electricity, no plumbing, poor, and really, really heavily populated, using obviously any material available to pretty much create their home and their shelter. And when I was in South Africa, the South Africans are amazingly resourceful. Here is a bicycle that a little boy made, that I bought from a little boy, that is made out of, it looked like a soda can, and some wire and some tape. And yeah, pretty cool. Okay, so they could not leave their homeland without their passbook, and these were their documents that they had to carry around if they were 16, anyone over 16 years old, and it kept them from going into the white South African areas. So again, creating these laws and these rules that made it impossible to, get into this completely separate world that white South Africans lived in. So the passbooks gave them permission to only be in white areas for a certain amount of time, and they would get arrested if they didn't have their book. And a lot of times they were in white areas because they were working for white families as, housekeepers, or doing work for them, nannies or whatever. Here's a picture of people lining up at the counter of a government office to get their new passbooks in the capital of Johannesburg in 1960. And you see an example of one on the bottom right. And of course, people protested and resisted. Which brings us to the African National Congress. And that is where I'm going to stop for today, and we will pick up there tomorrow.